Long before cities, kingdoms, or written history, there came a forgotten dawn when our ancient ancestors began to look unmistakably human. Their faces, bodies, and minds were changing, and with them the future of our entire species. But when did humanity truly begin to look like us? And what happened to the other human forms that disappeared along the way? If you love exploring the lost chapters of our ancient past, like this video, subscribe to the channel and join us as we journey back to the moment humanity first became familiar. Long before cities, long before farming, long before anyone carved a name into stone, Africa is already filled with people whose faces are beginning to look strangely familiar. The transformation does not happen in a single valley or on a single morning. There is no sharp line where one species vanishes and another suddenly appears. Instead, across immense stretches of time, scattered human populations carry different pieces of what will eventually become the modern human form. Some have faces that seem unexpectedly like ours. Others retain heavy brows, long skulls, powerful jaws, and proportions inherited from much older ancestors. The world around them is just as unstable. Grasslands spread, retreat and return. Lakes swell across basins that will later become desert. Forest corridors open and close. Rivers change course. Entire populations may find themselves separated for thousands of years, then connected again when climate shifts redraw the landscape. Somewhere inside this restless continent, the human body is being reshaped, but the evidence suggests that the process is far messier than the old idea of a single birthplace and a single evolutionary leap. Around 300,000 years ago, the African continent is inhabited by forms of humanity that archaeologists struggle to fit neatly into modern categories. Fossils from this period can look unsettlingly intermediate. Their faces may be reduced and flatter than those of earlier humans, yet their brain cases remain long and low. Their teeth can fall within or near modern ranges, while the bones around them retain robust features. Even the word modern becomes difficult because different parts of the body seem to arrive at different times. What survives in the record suggests that Homo sapiens does not emerge as a finished package. Instead, traits accumulate unevenly across populations over tens of thousands of years. Scholars still debate exactly which fossils deserve to be called early Homo sapiens and which belong to closely related ancestral populations, but the broader pattern is increasingly difficult to ignore. Humanity seems to take shape as a mosaic. The landscape helps explain why. Middle Pleistocene Africa is not a uniform homeland. It is a continent repeatedly reorganized by climate. During wetter intervals, parts of the Sahara contain rivers, lakes, grasslands, and wildlife corridors. During drier phases, those connections shrink or disappear. In eastern Africa, volcanic highlands, rift valleys, lake systems, and open plains create another patchwork of habitats. Farther south, coastlines, interior grasslands, caves, and seasonal environments support populations living under different ecological pressures. These groups are not completely isolated, but neither are they constantly connected. Over generations, separation allows local differences to develop. Later reconnection permits genes, technologies, and behaviors to spread between them. This pattern may help explain why early human anatomy appears in scattered combinations rather than in one clean evolutionary sequence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To understand how extraordinary this period is, it helps to look farther back. Earlier members of the human lineage, including forms often grouped with Homo erectus and related African populations, already possess bodies well suited for long-distance walking and life on the ground. They are tall compared with much older hominins, their legs are relatively long, and their hands are capable of precise manipulation. They make stone tools, transport materials, exploit meat and plant resources, and survive across environments that would challenge any large primate. Yet their skulls generally remain very different from ours. Thick brow ridges dominate the upper face. The cranial vault is long and low. The bones are often robust. Evolution has already produced a recognizably human way of moving through the world, but not yet the familiar head that looks back from a modern mirror. Then gradually the face begins to change. This is one of the most striking developments in the story. Modern humans have relatively small retracted faces positioned beneath a more vertical forehead, rather than projecting strongly forward. The brow ridge is reduced. The cheek region is reorganized. The jaws and teeth generally become smaller. These changes do not occur all at once, but by roughly 300,000 years ago, some African fossils already possess surprisingly modern facial proportions. The rest of the skull, however, tells a different story. Brain size may already fall within the broad modern range, yet the brain case itself remains elongated rather than globular. It is as though evolution has begun assembling the modern human head from the front backward. This matters because for much of the 20th century, human origins were often imagined as a relatively straightforward sequence. One ancestral form gradually becomes another, until modern Homo sapiens appears, perhaps in one region, carrying a distinct set of anatomical and behavioral innovations. The fossil record resists that simplicity. New discoveries keep revealing combinations that were not expected. A face can look modern while the back of the skull does not. A jaw can seem archaic while associated technology appears sophisticated. Populations separated by enormous distances can share certain traits while differing sharply in others. No single explanation fully accounts for every fossil, especially because the record is painfully incomplete. Africa is vast, and only a tiny fraction of the landscapes occupied by ancient humans have preserved bones that have later been discovered. Preservation itself creates an illusion. Human populations may have lived for thousands of generations without leaving a fossil that survives to the present. Acidic soils destroy bone. Erosion removes sediments. Geological processes bury sites beyond reach. Many regions that may have been crucial to early human evolution remain poorly sampled simply because fieldwork has historically concentrated in places where fossils are easier to find. This means the known fossils are not a complete family portrait. They are scattered photographs from a missing album. Each new specimen can therefore change the apparent story dramatically, not necessarily because evolution itself was abrupt, but because the surviving evidence is so sparse. Even so, several patterns emerge. By the later Middle Pleistocene, human populations across Africa are showing anatomical trends toward lighter skeletons, smaller faces, altered skull architecture, and increasingly modern dental patterns. Their tools also become more varied. Instead of relying only on large cutting tools associated with earlier traditions, many groups produce carefully prepared stone cores designed to remove flakes of predictable shapes. Points become more common. Raw materials may travel considerable distances. These technologies do not prove that the makers thought exactly as people do today, but they reveal planning, technical knowledge, and social learning. The old division between a primitive body and a suddenly modern mind begins to break down. The most important realization is that the beginning of Homo sapiens may not have been an event at all. It may have been a prolonged period when multiple connected populations slowly accumulated characteristics that later become typical of our species. Some traits spread through migration and interbreeding. Others may evolve independently under similar pressures. Population networks repeatedly fragment and reconnect as climates change. Over enough time, those networks produce something new, without any generation being obviously different from the one before it. And that creates the central mystery. If someone could stand in Africa 300,000 years ago and watch these populations from a distance, there might be no obvious moment when humanity becomes us. The change would be almost invisible from one generation to the next. Yet beneath that apparent continuity, the architecture of the human face, skull, body, and perhaps social world is quietly shifting. The familiar human form is beginning to emerge not from darkness in a sudden flash, but like a landscape appearing slowly through morning mist. The mist does not lift over one privileged corner of Africa. It rises and falls across an entire continent, and that may be the most important clue to how the first people who looked like us actually came into being. For decades, the search for human origins often favored the image of a cradle, one relatively small region, where Homo sapiens appears, grows, and eventually spreads outward. It is an appealing picture because it gives the story a center. Yet the deeper the fossil genetic and environmental evidence becomes, the more difficult it is to reduce early humanity to a single isolated homeland. Africa during the Middle Pleistocene is enormous, ecologically varied and repeatedly transformed by climate. Human groups live within this changing geography, like populations scattered across islands, except the islands themselves are made from deserts, forests, mountains, river systems, and temporary corridors that appear and disappear over thousands of years. A group living near a large lake in eastern Africa might have access to fish-water birds, wetland plants, grazing animals, and dependable fresh water. Hundreds of kilometers away, another population may occupy semi-arid grassland where survival depends on following migrating herds and knowing seasonal water sources. Farther north, the Sahara is not always the vast barrier recognizable today. During wetter phases, monsoon systems push rainfall farther north, filling depressions with lakes and sending rivers across landscapes that later become almost completely dry. Hippopotamuses, crocodiles, fish, and other water-dependent animals leave traces in places now dominated by sand and stone. Humans move through these green intervals as well, entering regions that would later become extraordinarily difficult to cross. Then the climate changes again. Rain belts shift, lakes contract, vegetation retreats, routes that once linked distant groups begin to narrow. A population that had exchanged people information and perhaps stone materials with neighbors can become increasingly isolated. Several thousand years of separation is more than enough time for genetic differences to accumulate, for local anatomical traits to become more common, and for technologies to develop distinctive patterns. This does not require dramatic evolutionary transformation. Small changes repeated through generations are enough. When wetter conditions eventually return, separated populations may encounter one another again. Their descendants exchange genes. Ideas travel. Tool-making traditions mix. The continent functions not as a single evolutionary laboratory, but as a shifting network. This kind of population structure may explain one of the strangest features of early Homo sapiens fossils. Traits associated with modern humans appear in different places and combinations. Northern Africa preserves individuals with surprisingly modern-looking faces at a very early date. Eastern Africa yields fossils with other combinations of modern and archaic characteristics. Southern African discoveries add still more variation to the picture. Scholars still debate how these remains should be classified because biological populations rarely fit the neat boxes that names impose upon them. A fossil may seem modern in one anatomical region and ancient in another. Rather than evidence of confusion in evolution, that inconsistency may be exactly what should be expected if different populations contribute different pieces to a gradually forming species. Geography does more than separate people. It shapes what they must know. In a patchy landscape, survival depends on memory and flexibility. Water may be predictable in one region and highly seasonal in another. Plant foods ripen at different times. Large animals move in response to rainfall. Stone suitable for toolmaking may exist only at certain outcrops. People who travel between these resources must carry knowledge of places not visible from where they stand. A journey across open country is therefore also a journey across a mental map. This does not prove the existence of language or symbolic thought in any modern sense, but it reminds us that early humans are not simply reacting to the environment moment by moment. Their survival increasingly depends on accumulated knowledge passed through generations. One lesser-known feature of this world is how often volcanic activity becomes part of the archaeological record, especially in eastern Africa. Layers of volcanic ash can blanket enormous regions, sometimes preserving distinct horizons that scientists later use to correlate sites separated by great distances. For the people living through such events, however, ashfall is not a dating tool. It is an environmental disruption. Water can become contaminated, plants buried, and animals displaced. Some eruptions may force populations to move, while others alter landscapes only temporarily. Combined with changing rainfall and temperature, these disturbances contribute to a world where mobility is not simply a choice, but often a necessity. Population size matters as well. Small groups are vulnerable in ways that large populations are not. A drought, disease outbreak, failed hunting season, or local ecological collapse can remove entire communities. Skills and traditions can disappear if the few people who possess them die without passing them on. Conversely, when groups reconnect, knowledge can spread rapidly through social contact. Archaeological traditions therefore need not represent fixed ethnic or biological identities. Similar tools can be made by genetically different populations, while closely related groups can develop different technologies. The evidence remains incomplete, and stone artifacts alone cannot tell researchers exactly who made them or how those people understood themselves. The repeated rhythm of isolation and reconnection also affects human relationships at a deeper level. If neighboring populations become separated for many generations, they may acquire subtle biological differences without becoming completely incompatible. When contact resumes, interbreeding can merge those differences back into a larger population network. Modern genetics shows clearly that later human populations repeatedly mixed with distinct lineages, and the same general process may have occurred within Africa much earlier. Instead of imagining a ladder in which one form replaces another, it may be more useful to imagine braided streams. They divide, follow separate channels, and join again downstream. This perspective changes the meaning of a human birthplace. There may still have been regions that contributed disproportionately to the ancestry of later populations, and some areas certainly preserve stronger evidence than others. But a species spread across a vast continent does not need to originate from a single, village-sized population. Early Homo sapiens may emerge through interaction among several partially separated groups connected over long periods. Different regions become important at different times as climates open or close pathways. The place that seems peripheral during one wet-dry cycle may become a major corridor in another. Even coastlines are unstable. During glacial periods, enormous quantities of water become locked in ice sheets, lowering global sea level and exposing land that is submerged today. Ancient coastal plains where humans may have lived, traveled, gathered shellfish, and exchanged materials are now underwater. This means part of the evidence for early human mobility may lie beneath modern seas. Archaeologists are working with a map missing some of its most habitable edges, and so the first recognizably modern humans do not emerge against a static background. They are shaped by movement across a continent that repeatedly changes beneath them. Deserts become grasslands, lakes appear and vanish. corridors open through regions that later become barriers. Populations separate, persist, fail, reconnect, and mix. The human story becomes distributed across landscapes so different that no single excavation can contain it. By the time certain faces begin to resemble ours, the process behind them may already involve countless journeys between communities whose names, languages, and memories have disappeared completely. Among all the clues scattered through this ancient African world, few are as arresting as the fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. They force the story of Homo sapiens away from the comfortable idea of a recent fully formed beginning and into a much deeper past. The remains are roughly 300,000 years old, yet several of the faces preserved there are unexpectedly familiar. The brow ridges are present, the skulls are not fully modern, and the brain cases remain long and low, but the faces themselves are relatively small and flat compared with many earlier humans. Seen from the front, some of these individuals approach the basic proportions of people alive today. Seen from the side or from above, the differences become obvious. They belong to a stage of human evolution, when the front of the head is changing faster than the back, leaving behind a combination that looks both recognizable and ancient at the same time. That combination is precisely what makes Jebel Irhoud so important. Earlier ideas about the emergence of Homo sapiens often assumed that the defining features of modern humans appeared together. A rounded skull, reduced face, smaller teeth, lighter skeleton, and more modern behavior might all have been expected to arrive as part of one evolutionary transition. The fossils refuse to cooperate with that neat package. Their facial anatomy is far more modern than their cranial shape, suggesting that the human form develops piece by piece. The evidence remains incomplete, but this pattern supports the broader idea that different traits emerge at different rates and perhaps in different populations before being brought together through migration and interbreeding. The site itself adds another layer. Jebel Irhoud was first known from mining activity, and some of the earliest remains were discovered decades before improved dating methods transformed their significance. Later excavation and analysis pushed the age of the site much farther back than once thought. That revision changes more than a number. It places people with distinctly Homo sapiens-like facial features around 100,000 years earlier than many older models expected. Suddenly, the roots of the species are no longer confined to a relatively recent episode in Eastern Africa. Northern Africa becomes part of the core story. The people at Jebel Irhoud are not preserved alone. Stone tools occur with them, including prepared core technologies characteristic of the Middle Stone Age. These tools are made through careful planning. A stone core is shaped in advance so that a flake of a desired size and form can be removed with a controlled strike. This is not random breakage. It requires an understanding of fracture patterns, sequence, and material quality. Such methods appear in different forms across Africa during roughly the same broad period, suggesting that technological change is also unfolding across wide regions rather than at one isolated point. Fire has left traces as well. Burned flint from the site played a crucial role in dating because heating resets certain mineral signals, allowing scientists to estimate when those pieces were last exposed to high temperatures. For the people living there, however, fire is much more than a laboratory clock. It provides warmth, protection, light, and a means of cooking. It may also create a social center where food is processed and knowledge passed on. The archaeology cannot recover the words spoken around those fires if words were spoken in anything like a modern form, but the repeated association of people, tools, and controlled fire suggests organized daily life rather than isolated survival. The surrounding environment is also easy to misimagine. Present-day Morocco can be dry, but North Africa, 300,000 years ago, experiences major climatic fluctuations. Periods of increased rainfall transform portions of the region into grasslands and wooded environments with lakes and rivers. Large mammals move through landscapes that are far more productive than the modern Sahara. Humans can follow those ecological corridors north and west across areas that later become formidable barriers. Jebel Irhoud therefore sits within a wider network of potential movement, rather than at the edge of an empty desert. One surprising detail is that the faces from Jebel Irhoud are not merely smaller versions of archaic faces. Their structure is reorganized. The relationship between the cheekbones, upper jaw, and nasal region begins to resemble later Homo sapiens in ways that are not easily explained by simple size reduction. This implies developmental changes in how the face grows. Evolution is modifying the architecture of the head itself, yet the brain case tells a slower story. Modern humans usually possess a more globular cranial vault with expanded parietal regions and a rounded rear portion of the skull. The Jebel Irhoud individuals lack that strongly rounded form. Their endocranial shape suggests that brain organization is not yet fully modern, even if overall brain volume may fall within a broadly comparable range. This distinction matters. A large brain is not automatically a modern brain. Shape can reflect changes in the relative development of different regions, connectivity and growth patterns, although fossils cannot reveal neural circuitry directly. Scholars still debate exactly how much can be inferred from the interior shape of fossil skulls, so caution is necessary. The important point is that the evolution of the human brain may continue after much of the face already looks increasingly familiar. This turns the usual intuition upside down. One might expect the brain to lead and the face to follow, but the fossil sequence does not provide such a simple progression. Physical modernity is itself layered. Jebel Irhoud also complicates the meaning of species labels. If these people walked into a modern city wearing contemporary clothing, their heads would still appear noticeably different, but their faces might not seem utterly alien. They sit close enough to later Homo sapiens that many researchers include them within the early part of our species, yet distinct enough that the boundary remains a subject of discussion. Nature does not provide convenient labels to paleontologists. Populations change gradually, and the names applied much later are attempts to organize that continuity. Other fossils from Africa reinforce the same problem. Remains from sites separated by thousands of kilometers show different combinations of ancestral and derived traits. Some jaws appear surprisingly modern, while associated skull fragments remain robust. Some crania have large brain capacities but retain older shapes. The record is uneven, and many specimens consist of only partial remains. As a result, researchers are sometimes reconstructing evolutionary relationships from fragments of a face, a portion of a jaw, or a piece of cranial vault. No single explanation fully accounts for the entire pattern. Still, the broad direction is becoming clearer. By around 300,000 years ago, the human lineage in Africa has entered a new anatomical phase. Faces are becoming smaller and more retracted. Teeth are generally reducing. Skull architecture is changing, though not yet complete. Technology shows increasingly standardized planning. Populations are distributed across distant regions, connected intermittently by favorable climates. The familiar human appearance is no longer something waiting far in the future. Parts of it are already present, and perhaps that is what makes these fossils so powerful. They do not look like a clean beginning. They look like a process caught halfway through. The forehead is not fully ours. The skull is not fully ours. The brain case still carries the geometry of an older humanity. But the face is crossing a threshold. In the stone and bone of North Africa 300,000 years ago, evolution has already produced people whose features begin to look back at us across an almost unimaginable distance. What emerges from these fossils is not a simple march from primitive to modern, but a mosaic assembled over immense spans of time. The word mosaic matters because it captures something that older evolutionary diagrams often hide. A population can possess one characteristic that seems strikingly modern, while retaining several others inherited from much earlier ancestors. Another population living thousands of kilometers away may show a different combination. The result is not confusion in the fossil record so much as a reminder that evolution works through populations, not through idealized stages. There is no requirement that the human face, skull, teeth, skeleton, brain shape, and behavior all transform at the same moment. Each trait can respond to different pressures, follow different developmental pathways, and spread through different populations at different speeds. This is especially visible in the contrast between facial form and cranial shape. By roughly 300,000 years ago, some early Homo sapiens already possess faces that are relatively retracted and gracile, compared with those of earlier humans. Yet their skulls remain elongated, their brow ridges more substantial, and the rear of the cranium less rounded than in most people alive today. Later fossils show other combinations. The overall pattern suggests that the anatomy associated with modern humans is assembled gradually. What survives in the record suggests that the species does not appear fully formed, but passes through long periods of anatomical experimentation in which older and newer features coexist within the same individuals. That coexistence is important because it challenges the instinct to search for a first modern human. There almost certainly is no single individual who can be meaningfully identified as the first Homo sapiens. Parents and children do not belong to visibly different species. The changes accumulate across thousands of generations until later, observers looking backward from the present begin drawing boundaries across a continuous process. Those boundaries are useful for classification, but they can create the illusion of suddenness. In reality, a person born 300,000 years ago may differ only slightly from their parents, yet belong to a population that over tens of thousands of years drifts steadily toward a new anatomical pattern. Development offers one possible explanation for how such large changes occur without requiring dramatic transformations in every generation. Small shifts in the timing and rate of growth can reshape the skull substantially. If the face stops projecting forward as strongly during development, if the cranial vault grows differently around the expanding brain, or if tooth and jaw growth are subtly altered, the resulting adult can look noticeably different, even though the underlying developmental mechanisms remain closely related to those of earlier populations. Evolution often modifies when and how long existing processes occur, rather than inventing entirely new structures from nothing. The human chin provides a useful example of how peculiar some modern traits are. A true projecting chin is common in Homo sapiens and rare or absent in other known human groups. Yet even this distinctive feature does not appear in a simple uniform way across the earliest members of our species. Some jaws approach the modern condition more closely than others. Researchers continue to debate exactly why the chin evolved. It may relate to changes in facial reduction and jaw development rather than serving a single direct function. No single explanation fully accounts for its form, and the uncertainty is a reminder that not every trait needs a simple adaptive story. The same caution applies to brow ridges. Earlier humans often possess heavy supraorbital structures above the eyes, while modern humans tend to have much smaller ones. It is tempting to imagine that reduced brow ridges reflect intelligence, but there is no good basis for treating them as a simple mental indicator. Their size relates to facial architecture, mechanical loading growth, and the geometry of the skull. As faces become smaller and sit more directly beneath the brain case, the massive bony structures seen in some earlier humans become less necessary or are simply altered as a consequence of broader developmental change. Teeth also participate in this gradual transformation. Across much of human evolution, tooth size trends downward, though not at a constant rate and not equally in every population. Changes in diet, food processing tool use, and jaw growth may all contribute. By the time early Homo sapiens are spreading across Africa, many individuals possess teeth that fall closer to modern dimensions, but robust jaws and unusual dental combinations still appear. Fossils rarely cooperate with neat categories. One specimen may look modern in the molars but archaic in the vault. Another may show the reverse. The postcranial skeleton, everything below the skull, adds still another layer. Early Homo sapiens are already fundamentally human in body plan. They are upright walkers with long legs, efficient bipedal locomotion, and hands capable of precision. But robusticity varies considerably. Some ancient individuals have thicker bones and stronger muscle attachments than most living humans, reflecting both inherited anatomy and physically demanding lives. A person crossing open terrain while carrying stone food water, or a young child, is living under mechanical stresses far removed from those of modern sedentary populations. Differences between ancient and living skeletons therefore reflect not only evolution but lifestyle. This makes reconstruction difficult. A thick bone can partly reflect genetics, partly activity, partly nutrition, and partly age. A small jaw can result from evolutionary change but also from development and diet. Scientists must disentangle these factors from incomplete fossils, often with only a handful of individuals representing tens of thousands of years. Scholars still debate the weight that should be given to particular anatomical features when defining early Homo sapiens, and disagreements are inevitable when the evidence is fragmentary, yet the mosaic pattern becomes more convincing as discoveries accumulate. Instead of one population suddenly acquiring everything associated with modern humans, different groups appear to contribute different pieces. Some early North African fossils bring a surprisingly modern face into the record. Later Eastern African fossils show more rounded cranial forms. Southern African sites preserve evidence of behavioral complexity that does not line up perfectly with anatomical milestones elsewhere. This mismatch may be a problem only if one assumes there must be a single center and a single timetable. A more flexible picture fits the evidence better. Imagine a vast network of populations occasionally separated by climate and geography. One group develops a slightly more gracile face. Another experiences changes in cranial development. Another preserves genetic variants that later spread widely. When climatic corridors reopen, those populations reconnect. People move. Families form across group boundaries. Traits once limited to one region enter another. Over many cycles, the differences do not simply accumulate in isolation. They are repeatedly recombined. This process also explains why the earliest Homo sapiens can feel so familiar and so strange at once. They are not incomplete versions of modern people. They are successful humans adapted to their own world, carrying combinations of traits that later become rearranged, reduced, or lost. Their anatomy is not moving toward a predetermined destination. Evolution has no knowledge of what humans will look like 200,000 years later. The familiar form emerges only in retrospect. That distinction is crucial. Humanity does not begin when a skull finally satisfies a modern checklist. It begins as a population process distributed through bodies that blur every boundary researchers try to impose. Somewhere between the heavy architecture of earlier humans and the rounded skulls of later Homo sapiens, countless generations live ordinary lives without ever knowing they stand inside an evolutionary transition. The face is already changing. The brain case is still catching up. and behind both something even more subtle is beginning to shift. Behind the increasingly familiar face, another transformation is unfolding more slowly. It is hidden inside the skull, visible only because bone preserves a rough impression of the organ it once surrounded. The brains of early Homo sapiens are already large, often overlapping substantially in volume with those of living humans. But volume alone conceals one of the most intriguing changes in our evolution. A brain can contain roughly the same amount of tissue while being organized inside a differently shaped cranial vault. At Jebel Irhoud, the face has moved surprisingly close to the modern condition, yet the brain case remains elongated. In later Homo sapiens, that vault becomes more rounded and globular. Somewhere between those forms lies a gradual reorganization that may be one of the least obvious stages in the emergence of humanity as it exists today. Fossil skulls cannot preserve thoughts, memories, emotions, or neural connections. Brain tissue disappears rapidly after death under normal conditions. What sometimes remains is the inner surface of the cranial cavity, and from this researchers can produce an endocast, essentially a reconstruction of the space once occupied by the brain and surrounding tissues. Endocasts reveal broad proportions, certain impressions left by blood vessels, and aspects of overall brain shape. They do not allow scientists to read an ancient mind. Any attempt to connect a particular cranial contour directly to language imagination or symbolic thought would go far beyond the evidence. Even so, comparisons among fossil humans reveal a pattern that is difficult to dismiss. The earliest known Homo sapiens-like individuals do not possess the strongly globular brain case typical of recent humans. Their cranial vaults are longer and lower, preserving a geometry closer in some respects to earlier forms of Homo. Over tens of thousands of years, the shape changes. The parietal regions become more expanded, the rear of the skull becomes rounder, and the overall vault approaches the compact globular form seen widely in later Homo sapiens. Researchers studying these changes have argued that modern brain shape evolves after the characteristic modern face has already begun to appear. The sequence is striking because it means there is no single anatomical moment when every part of the head becomes modern. Brain size makes the story even more counterintuitive. Bigger is not simply better, nor does human evolution consist of an uninterrupted increase in cranial capacity. Neanderthals, for example, often possess brains as large as or larger than those of living Homo sapiens. Some ancient Homo sapiens also have average cranial capacities that exceed those of many recent populations. The important evolutionary questions, therefore, concern organization, development, connectivity, energetic cost, and how neural systems interact, not a simplistic race toward maximum volume. Modern human brains are remarkable, not because they are the largest possible brains, but because of what their particular organization allows them to do. One especially interesting clue comes from development. Modern human infants undergo a distinctive phase of brain growth after birth, during which the brain case becomes increasingly globular. This early developmental pattern differs from what researchers can infer for Neanderthals, although both groups begin life with broadly similar elongated cranial forms. That suggests some of the adult differences between human groups may arise from changes in developmental timing during infancy. Small genetic changes affecting when different brain regions grow could ultimately alter the proportions of the adult brain without requiring a sudden increase in total size. The implications are tempting, but caution is essential. Expanded parietal regions in modern humans have sometimes been discussed in relation to sensory integration, attention, spatial processing, tool use, and other cognitive functions. Changes involving the cerebellar region may also matter because the cerebellum contributes not only to movement, but to complex cognitive processes. Yet a fossil skull cannot demonstrate that an individual possessed a specific mental ability. Scholars still debate how anatomical reorganization relates to behavioral change, and the archaeological record does not reveal a clean moment when a new brain shape suddenly produces modern culture. Instead, behavior also appears gradually. People make sophisticated tools long before the most fully modern cranial shape becomes widespread. They plan sequences of stone reduction, select particular raw materials, exploit diverse environments, and presumably maintain complex social knowledge. This means early Homo sapiens with elongated brain cases are not cognitively simple. Their survival across unstable African environments already requires flexibility and learning. Whatever later neurological changes occur, they build upon capacities that are deeply established. There is also an energetic dimension to the brain that fossils rarely communicate. Neural tissue is expensive. The human brain represents only a small proportion of body mass, but consumes a substantial share of resting energy. Supporting such an organ requires reliable access to calories and nutrients, especially during childhood. Cooking food, sharing meat consumption, underground plant foods, aquatic resources, and increasingly efficient foraging may all contribute to the ecological foundation that makes large-brained humans possible. Exactly when each behavior becomes important remains debated, but the brain cannot evolve independently of the stomach, the landscape, or the social group. Childhood may therefore be central to the story. Human children depend on others for an unusually long time. A prolonged period of growth provides an extended window for learning toolmaking landscapes, social relationships, food processing, and communication. It also creates vulnerability. A mother caring for a slowly developing child benefits from assistance, whether from fathers, grandparents, siblings, or other members of a group. The exact structure of early Homo sapiens families cannot be reconstructed confidently, but cooperative care is likely to have deep evolutionary roots. A brain capable of extraordinary learning is useful only if a social system can keep that brain alive while it develops. One lesser-known aspect of the fossil record is that changes toward modern globularity may continue for a remarkably long period after the earliest fossils assigned to Homo sapiens appear. Estimates vary depending on specimens and methods, but the overall trajectory suggests that people living around 300,000 years ago are not simply anatomically identical versions of humans alive today. The architecture continues evolving deep into our species' history. This is important because the label Homo sapiens covers a substantial range of anatomical diversity that has since narrowed or changed. The same principle may apply to behavior. Archaeologists once searched for a dramatic cognitive revolution, a point when modern minds seemingly appeared and symbolic culture exploded. Increasingly, African evidence suggests a more complicated process. Innovations arise, sometimes disappear, and later reappear. Technologies do not always spread permanently. Symbolic practices may flourish locally without becoming universal. Population size and connections between groups can determine whether an innovation survives. A brilliant technique invented in a small isolated community can vanish completely if that population collapses, so the changing brain case should not be imagined as a switch being turned on. It is part of a much larger system in which anatomy, childhood, social networks, diet, mobility, climate, and culture influence one another. The evidence remains incomplete, and there may never be a fossil capable of revealing precisely when the mental world of an ancient person becomes recognizably like ours. But something measurable is happening. The face has already retreated beneath the front of the skull. The teeth are changing. The body has long been capable of crossing enormous landscapes. Now the vault surrounding the brain is slowly becoming rounder. Generation after generation, almost invisibly, the head of Homo sapiens is acquiring another part of its familiar form. and as that transformation continues, Eastern Africa begins to preserve fossils in which the ancient and modern pieces are drawn together more closely than ever before. By the time the story reaches the ancient sediments of the lower Omo Valley in southwestern Ethiopia, the human face that first appeared in fragments across earlier Africa is joined by a skull that looks more decisively familiar. Here in a landscape shaped by rivers, volcanic eruptions, shifting lakes and repeated climatic change, researchers recover remains that become central to the question of when anatomically modern humans truly appear. The fossils known as Homo I and Homo II come from the Kibish Formation, but they do not look identical. Homo I possesses a suite of features strongly associated with Homo sapiens, while Homo II is considerably more robust and retains characteristics that once encouraged researchers to interpret it as more archaic. Two individuals from the same broad ancient landscape therefore preserve the lesson already emerging elsewhere. Early humanity contains far more anatomical variation than the modern world might lead us to expect. Dating the Homo remains has been difficult, and their estimated age has changed as geological methods have improved. Volcanic ash layers are especially important in this part of Africa, because eruptions leave chemical fingerprints across the landscape. Researchers can compare the composition of ash near archaeological or fossil deposits with deposits produced by known volcanic events elsewhere. Work on the volcanic sequence has established that the sediments containing Homo I are older than an eruption, now dated to roughly 233,000 years ago. The fossil itself may be older still. Rather than providing a perfectly precise birthday for the individual, the geology gives a minimum age and pushes an unmistakably Homo sapiens-like anatomy deep into the Middle Pleistocene. This uncertainty is not a weakness unique to Homo. It is typical of deep prehistory. Fossils are rarely accompanied by convenient geological clocks. Sediments move. Rivers cut through older deposits and lay down new ones. Volcanic ash can be reworked after its original deposition. Researchers must reconstruct sequences from chemistry stratigraphy, mineral grains, fossils, and landscape formation. The result is often a range rather than a single date. Scholars still debate details of the Kibish chronology, but the important conclusion remains secure. Humans with strongly modern anatomical features are living in Eastern Africa well over 200,000 years ago. Homo I is particularly important because the skull possesses a relatively high and rounded vault compared with earlier specimens such as those from Jebel Irhoud. The face is more gracile, and the overall combination lies much closer to later Homo sapiens. The lower jaw includes a well-developed chin, one of the more distinctive anatomical features of our species. Yet even here the word modern should not imply identical. The skeleton is ancient and its proportions exist within a range of human variation broader than that commonly encountered among people today. The contrast with Homo II makes the sight even more revealing. Homo II has a thicker, more robust cranial vault and a less obviously modern appearance. Researchers have debated exactly how to interpret the difference, but it demonstrates that populations living during this period can include individuals whose anatomy does not fit a single narrow template. Some variation may reflect sex, individual development, or population structure. Some may preserve deeper evolutionary differences. The evidence remains incomplete because two skulls cannot reveal the full diversity of an entire region. The environment surrounding them is equally important. The Omo River flows toward Lake Turkana through one of Africa's great geological corridors. Today the region can be harsh and dry, but its ancient environments fluctuate dramatically. River channels migrate across floodplains. Lake levels rise and fall. Wetlands expand during favorable intervals and contract during drought. Grasslands support grazing animals while river margins provide plant foods and water. For human populations, this is not simply scenery. Every environmental change alters the map of survival. A group living beside a productive wetland may gather edible plants, hunt or scavenge animals drawn to water, and exploit fish or other aquatic resources where available. When the water retreats, those same people or their descendants may need to travel farther, change prey, or abandon familiar territory. Such instability rewards flexibility. It also brings populations together at shrinking resource zones, potentially increasing contact between groups that had previously lived apart. When wetter conditions return, those populations can disperse again along renewed river systems and grasslands. Stone tools from the broader region reveal communities already embedded in Middle Stone Age technological traditions. Prepared core methods allow toolmakers to control the shape of flakes before striking them from the core. Point scrapers and cutting edges can be produced from carefully selected stone. The exact uses of individual artifacts are not always recoverable, and not every pointed tool was necessarily a weapon. Yet the manufacturing sequence itself demonstrates planning. A mistake early in preparation can ruin the geometry required for later removals, so the maker must work toward a form that does not yet exist. This knowledge has to survive beyond one individual. Stoneworking traditions are learned behaviors, and their persistence across generations implies teaching through demonstration, observation, or other forms of communication. The archaeological record cannot tell researchers exactly how instruction occurs. There is no fossilized lesson beside the tools, but complex techniques do not reliably reproduce themselves without social transmission. The landscape of early Homo sapiens is therefore also a landscape of inherited knowledge. One surprising feature of the Homo story is how much of its chronology depends on catastrophes that ancient humans would have experienced as disruptions. A volcanic eruption hundreds of kilometers away can throw ash high into the atmosphere and spread it across enormous areas. Tens or hundreds of thousands of years later, that ash becomes a marker by which scientists connect distant landscapes. For the people beneath it, however, the event may darken. Skies contaminate water cover vegetation and alter animal movements. What becomes a gift to geochronology begins as an environmental hazard, yet Homo sapiens persists. That persistence may be more significant than any single anatomical feature. These people are living in a region where ecological conditions can change substantially within spans short enough to affect generations. Their success depends not on perfect adaptation to one habitat, but on the capacity to alter behavior as habitats change. Mobility, cooperation, technological flexibility, and accumulated knowledge become forms of insurance against an unpredictable world. Homo therefore represents more than an old skull with modern characteristics. It belongs to a broader transition in which the anatomical pieces first seen separately begin to converge. The face is reduced, the chin is present, the cranial vault approaches the shape associated with later humans. But the presence of the more robust Homo too warns against imagining that every population across Africa has reached the same form simultaneously. Evolution remains geographically uneven. This unevenness may be exactly what the earlier population network predicts. Traits emerging in one region spread through contact while other characteristics persist locally for long periods. Different populations contribute to a species whose boundaries remain porous. Over thousands of generations, the mosaic becomes increasingly recognizable, but traces of older humanity continue beside it, and those traces do not disappear immediately. Farther north in Ethiopia, another group leaves behind skulls that are unmistakably close to Homo sapiens, yet still unusually robust. Their bones will preserve not only anatomy, but evidence of deliberate treatment after death, drawing the story toward a world where the familiar human form is becoming entangled with behaviors that hint at increasingly complex relationships between the living and the dead. The trail leads north through Ethiopia to the Middle Awash, where sediments preserve another population standing close to the anatomical world of living humans without fitting perfectly inside it. At Herto, remains of several individuals date to roughly 160,000 years ago, placing them tens of thousands of years after the earliest known Homo sapiens-like faces, and well after the evolutionary process has begun reshaping the human skull. The Herto people are unmistakably close to us. Their cranial capacities are large, their overall anatomy belongs comfortably within the broad Homo sapiens pattern, and their faces no longer resemble those of much earlier members of the genus. Yet the skulls are strikingly robust. Heavy brow regions, strong cranial architecture, and other features make them look more powerfully built than most humans alive today. The modern form is becoming clearer, but evolution has not erased its deeper inheritance. When the Herto fossils were formally described, researchers proposed the name Homo sapiens idaltu for these ancient people, treating them as a subspecies of Homo sapiens. That label has not been universally adopted, and many researchers simply regard the remains as early Homo sapiens. The disagreement is useful because it exposes a recurring difficulty. Paleontologists must place names on populations that change continuously through time. A fossil can be too modern to fit comfortably among earlier archaic humans, while remaining too robust to resemble the average person today. Taxonomy creates lines because science needs language, but ancient populations did not evolve according to those lines. The best preserved adult skull from Herto makes this tension especially vivid. Its brain case is large, but the bones are thick and the brow region pronounced. Another adult specimen is more fragmentary. The remains of a child add a more intimate dimension, because these fossils do not merely document anatomy. Some of the Herto bones appear to have been deliberately modified after death. Cut marks and polished surfaces have been interpreted as evidence that the dead were processed in a careful, repeated manner rather than simply abandoned. Exactly what that treatment means is uncertain. Cut marks on human bones can have many causes, including defleshing, associated with mortuary preparation, nutritional cannibalism, violence, or other practices that leave similar traces. At Herto, the pattern has often been interpreted as mortuary behavior, because parts of the skull appear to have been handled and modified in ways that may not fit ordinary butchery. The child's cranium is particularly intriguing because it seems to show repeated scraping and polishing. Scholars still debate the precise meaning of these modifications, and no surviving evidence can reveal what the people performing them believed. That uncertainty is important. It would be easy to project later religious concepts onto ancient bones and declare that Herto proves belief in an afterlife. The archaeology cannot support such certainty. What can be said is more restrained and perhaps more interesting. Some of these human remains appear to have received deliberate attention after death. The bodies were not necessarily treated like ordinary animal carcasses. If the interpretation is correct, the dead remained socially significant even after life had ended. Such behavior requires memory. A corpse is biologically inert, but socially it can continue to represent a parent-child companion, rival, or member of a community. Treating remains in a structured way suggests that relationships may persist beyond immediate physical presence. This does not require formal religion. It requires only that the living attach meaning to the dead, something that eventually becomes nearly universal among later human societies. Around Herto, the landscape provides a rich setting for these lives. The Middle Awash preserves evidence of ancient lake shores, river environments, and grasslands occupied by large mammals. Hippopotamuses and other animals indicate substantial bodies of water at various times. Humans exploit this environment with Middle Stone Age technologies, producing flakes and points while using a range of local resources. Their world is not an empty wilderness populated by a few wandering figures. It is an ecosystem crowded with prey, predators, seasonal changes, and competing human groups. Large African carnivores remain serious competitors. Lions, hyenas, and other predators can take carcasses, threaten vulnerable people, and influence where humans sleep or process food. Human success depends partly on cooperation. A solitary individual carrying meat is far more vulnerable than a coordinated group capable of defending a location. Fire may help as may weapons and vigilance, but social organization itself becomes one of the most effective survival tools available. The Herto people are also physically capable inhabitants of this demanding landscape. Their robust bones should not be mistaken for primitiveness. Robusticity can reflect ancestry development and strenuous activity. Daily life places repeated loads on the skeleton. Stone must be collected and carried. Animals are processed. Plant foods are dug, cut, pounded, or transported. Children require care while groups move between resources. Even without agriculture or permanent architecture, life involves constant work. Their anatomy also reminds us that modern human gracility is partly a later development. Many Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens, thousands of generations after Herto, remain more robust than most recent humans. Skeletons become especially gracile after changes in subsistence and activity patterns over the later Holocene. The body seen in a modern office or city therefore should not be treated as the timeless standard of Homo sapiens. Our species has always contained considerable physical variation. At roughly 160,000 years ago, however, the broader evolutionary picture is becoming increasingly recognizable. The cranial vault is more modern than at Jebel Irhoud. Faces are reduced compared with older Homo. Chins and other diagnostic features appear in African fossils, yet regional differences remain strong. There is still no reason to imagine a continent populated by anatomically uniform people, nor is Africa the only place occupied by humans. Beyond the continent, other populations descended from earlier dispersals are developing along their own evolutionary paths. In Europe and Western Eurasia, the ancestors of Neanderthals have acquired distinctive anatomy adapted over long periods. Across Asia, other groups persist whose relationships will eventually prove far more complicated than researchers once imagined. Homo sapiens is becoming recognizable, but it's not becoming alone. That fact changes the meaning of the dawn. The emergence of our species is not the moment humanity replaces everything that came before. It is the moment one branch becomes increasingly distinct within a world still occupied by several human forms. Even inside Africa, older-looking traits persist. Outside it, other lineages continue evolving for tens of thousands of years. Herto therefore stands at an unusual point in the story. Its people possess skulls close enough to ours that their humanity is immediately recognizable, yet robust enough to preserve the physical memory of earlier populations. Their treatment of the dead may hint at relationships extending beyond death, although the evidence cannot reveal the ideas behind the marks. Their tools show planning their survival requires cooperation, and their landscape demands constant adaptation. The face is now familiar. The skull is approaching the modern form, but the human story is still far from settled. These bodies must survive in environments that can change within generations, and anatomy alone cannot guarantee that survival. What matters increasingly is how people move, find water, share resources, raise children, confront predators, and carry knowledge through a continent that never remains the same for long. The bodies carrying this increasingly familiar anatomy are not shaped in laboratories of bone and genes alone. They are shaped by distance. Day after day, early Homo sapiens moves through landscapes where food and water are scattered evenly, where shade can matter as much as strength, and where a failed judgment about the location of a spring can become fatal. The human body has already been committed to upright walking for millions of years, but by the Middle Pleistocene it belongs to a lineage unusually capable of covering ground. Long legs, spring-like tendons, efficient bipedal mechanics, abundant sweat glands, relatively sparse body hair, and an ability to regulate heat while moving under conditions that force many other mammals to rest, all contribute to a creature built not for spectacular speed, but for persistence. That does not mean early Homo sapiens spends every day running prey into exhaustion, as popular reconstructions sometimes suggest. Persistence hunting is practiced by some recent human groups and may have ancient roots, but proving its importance hundreds of thousands of years ago is extremely difficult. The anatomical evidence supports endurance locomotion broadly, not one universal hunting strategy. Early humans probably combined stalking, ambush, scavenging, trapping opportunities, cooperative pursuit, and intimate knowledge of animal behavior. Different landscapes reward different techniques. No single explanation fully accounts for how hunting develops across the enormous range occupied by ancient populations. Walking itself is enough to transform life. A group capable of moving efficiently between distant water sources can exploit a much larger territory. Stone from a useful outcrop can be carried away rather than used only where it is found. Meat can be transported to others. Plant foods can be gathered beyond the immediate camp. Individuals can maintain contact with neighboring communities separated by distances that would otherwise encourage isolation. Mobility, therefore, links anatomy to social life. The legs carry more than bodies. They carry information, materials, relationships, and genes. Heat places strict limits on that movement. Humans possess an unusual cooling system based heavily on sweating. Evaporating sweat can remove enormous amounts of heat, particularly in dry conditions, allowing sustained activity when many fur-covered mammals risk overheating. But this advantage comes with the dangerous water loss. A sweating human is dependent on reliable hydration. In hot environments, knowledge of springs, rivers, seasonal pools, water-bearing plants, and shaded roots becomes as important as any stone point. This creates a strange evolutionary bargain. Humans become capable of extraordinary endurance partly because they can shed heat effectively, yet that same capacity ties them tightly to landscapes of remembered water. A group entering unfamiliar territory cannot simply wander indefinitely. It needs information. Someone must know where the river still flows late in the dry season, which hollow retains water after rains vanish, and which route crosses exposed ground most safely. Such knowledge may be carried for decades inside human memory. Food presents the same problem on a larger scale. Early Homo sapiens is an omnivore, and that flexibility is one of the species' greatest strengths. Meat provides dense calories, protein, and important micronutrients, but plants remain essential in many environments. Underground storage organs, seeds, nuts, fruits, leaves, and other resources can fill seasonal gaps. Coastal and lakeside populations may add shellfish, fish, birds, or other aquatic foods. Archaeological preservation strongly favors bones and stone, so the ancient diet can appear more meat-heavy than it actually was. Plants often disappear almost completely, unless microscopic residues, phytoliths, starch, grains, charred remains, or unusual preservation conditions survive. The daily expertise required to gather those plants leaves little visible trace. Knowing that a tuber is edible only after processing, that a particular fruit ripens for a short period, or that certain seeds can be collected efficiently requires generations of observation. Much of human survival may therefore depend on knowledge archaeologists can barely see. Stone points survive for hundreds of thousands of years. A remembered map of edible roots does not. Fire extends the range of usable foods. Cooking can soften tough tissues, improve digestibility, reduce some pathogens, and make certain plant resources easier to process. Controlled fire is far older than Homo sapiens, although the frequency and sophistication of its use in different periods remain debated. By the time recognizably modern humans occupy Africa, fire is likely a deeply familiar technology in many populations. It changes evenings as much as meals. Darkness becomes less absolute around a hearth. Predators may be discouraged. Work can continue after sunset. Social proximity becomes almost unavoidable. Yet the body still bears the cost of a difficult life. Injuries accumulate, feet cross sharp stone, hands fracture while making tools or during falls, teeth wear from tough foods and abrasive particles. Infection can turn a small wound into a serious threat. There are no antibiotics, no surgical wards, and no guaranteed rescue if someone becomes unable to walk. Survival therefore depends partly on the willingness of others to share food and slow their movement for vulnerable companions. Evidence for care among earlier human relatives suggests that such cooperation has roots deeper than Homo sapiens. Individuals from several prehistoric populations survive injuries or impairments that may have required assistance. Interpreting specific cases is difficult because people can sometimes adapt to disability more effectively than modern observers assume. Still, the broader evolutionary importance of food sharing and cooperative care is difficult to avoid. Human children alone make extreme individual independence impossible. A Homo sapiens infant is neurologically unfinished compared with many mammals. The brain continues growing rapidly after birth while the child remains dependent for years. Childhood stretches into a prolonged apprenticeship. Young people must learn not only how to walk and eat, but how to identify tracks, make tools, recognize dangerous animals, locate water, understand social relationships, and interpret seasonal changes. A single mistake can be costly. Knowledge becomes cumulative because no individual has enough time to rediscover everything from scratch. Grandparents and other older adults may become especially valuable in such a system. An elderly person may not hunt as efficiently as a younger adult, but can carry decades of environmental memory. A drought remembered from childhood may reveal which distant spring survived when others failed. The fossil record cannot reconstruct the exact social roles of older individuals, and demographic patterns in deep prehistory remain uncertain. Yet longevity has consequences beyond reproduction when information itself is a survival resource. The human body is therefore embedded inside a collective system. Legs provide mobility, sweat provides cooling, hands manipulate tools, and brains store knowledge. But none of these functions reaches its full value in isolation. Groups can divide tasks, defend resources, share risk, and preserve techniques across generations. Culture begins acting almost like an additional layer of adaptation, allowing behavior to change faster than anatomy. This may help explain how Homo sapiens survives the climatic instability that repeatedly divides African populations. When rainfall shifts, genes cannot adapt within a few seasons. Behavior can. People can change routes, prey tools, gathering areas, and social alliances. They can move toward relatives in another region or carry unfamiliar resources back into their own territory. Flexibility becomes more valuable than specialization. And beneath this adaptability lies a paradox. The people of this period possess no cities, farms, roads, written maps, or permanent supply systems, yet they inhabit enormous mental landscapes. Their survival depends on knowing things that leave almost no archaeological trace. The shape of a valley, the smell of approaching rain, the season when animals gather the fracture quality of distant stone, the location of a hidden spring, all can matter. Bones show humanity becoming physically familiar, but bodies alone cannot explain what follows. Across these African landscapes, people are beginning to leave another kind of record: carefully prepared tools, transported materials, pigments, and objects, whose purposes are not always obvious. The traces are small, sometimes ambiguous, and separated by immense stretches of time. Yet they reveal that the world being built inside the human mind may soon become as important as the body carrying it. The stones begin to speak more clearly than the bones, though never clearly enough to remove all doubt. Across Africa, the people whose bodies are becoming increasingly familiar leave behind technologies that reveal planning learned routines and an ability to imagine the shape of an object before that object exists. Yet there is no sudden moment when an old, supposedly primitive technology disappears and a completely modern one replaces it. The transition into the Middle Stone Age unfolds unevenly, just as anatomy does. Different techniques overlap for long periods. Some innovations appear early in one region and much later elsewhere. Others vanish from the archaeological record after seemingly successful use. The technological story mirrors the biological one. Human modernity is assembled gradually through experimentation, transmission, loss, and rediscovery. Earlier African humans already possess impressive stoneworking traditions. Acheulean hand axes, cleavers, and related large cutting tools require far more skill than their familiar teardrop shapes might suggest. Producing a symmetrical hand axe means selecting suitable stone, controlling repeated fractures, maintaining usable edges, and often correcting mistakes during manufacture. Some examples are so carefully shaped that purely functional explanations seem insufficient, although claims that they served as symbolic objects remain speculative. Whatever their additional meanings, Acheulean tools demonstrate that complex planning does not begin with Homo sapiens. What changes during the Middle Stone Age is not intelligence suddenly appearing, but the growing importance of different technological strategies. Toolmakers increasingly prepare stone cores so that flakes of predetermined forms can be removed. Instead of shaping one large object from a block and carrying the finished piece, a skilled person can organize a core as a sort of multiple useful flakes. The geometry must be managed carefully. Surfaces are prepared, striking platforms adjusted, and previous removals used to guide later ones. The maker is effectively constructing a sequence in stone. This is sometimes associated with methods broadly described as Levallois technology, although Middle Stone Age stoneworking is far more varied than one label implies. Similar prepared core approaches occur outside Africa as well, and are used by other human populations, including Neanderthals. That matters because sophisticated stone technology cannot be treated as a unique signature of Homo sapiens. Several human lineages are capable of complex planning. The differences that eventually matter may lie less in whether a group can invent an advanced technique than in how widely and reliably innovations spread through social networks. Points become increasingly prominent in many Middle Stone Age assemblages. Some may have been held directly in the hand. Others were probably hafted onto wooden shafts, creating composite tools in which stone-wood binding material and perhaps adhesive work together. Hafting is a major technological step because failure in one component compromises the entire object. A point must have an appropriate base. The shaft must be shaped. Binding must hold under stress. Adhesives, where used, may require careful preparation. Evidence from later African sites shows that people sometimes produce compound adhesives using plant gums, ochre, or other ingredients. Exactly how early such recipes become widespread remains uncertain, but the principle is significant. A composite tool exists first as a mental sequence: gather materials from different places, prepare them in different ways, then combine them into something none could accomplish alone. The finished weapon may look simple, the chain of knowledge behind it is not. Wood itself creates a major blind spot. Stone survives because stone is stubborn. Wooden digging sticks, spears, containers, handles, and other organic technologies usually decay. A prehistoric campsite therefore reaches archaeologists stripped of much of its original equipment. People who appear to possess only flakes and points may once have been surrounded by baskets, hides, cords, wooden implements, and plant fiber objects. The evidence remains incomplete, and this preservation bias can make early technology seem poorer than it was. The same problem affects clothing. Animal skins and plant fibers rarely survive across Middle Pleistocene timescales. Yet humans entering cooler highlands, seasonal environments, or regions outside tropical Africa may need protection from cold. Scrapers and other tools could have been used in hide preparation, though assigning one function from shape alone is risky. Microscopic wear and residues can sometimes reveal how a tool was used, but most artifacts retain no definitive signature. Raw materials provide another clue to human movement. At some sites, stone is found many kilometers from the geological source where it originated. Such transport can occur because individuals travel long distances themselves, or because material passes between groups through exchange. Distinguishing those possibilities is difficult. Either way, stone is no longer simply picked up wherever someone happens to stand. Certain materials may be preferred for fracture quality, durability, appearance, or reasons now lost. This preference suggests that landscapes are being evaluated in increasingly detailed ways. One outcrop produces excellent points, another stone is easier to shape. A distant source may offer a distinctive color. Knowledge of these places can become socially inherited. People returning to the same source generations later participate in a geographical tradition, even though no road or written marker identifies the destination. Technology also reveals conservatism. A successful tool-making method can persist for astonishing periods. Modern observers often equate innovation with progress, but constant novelty can be dangerous when survival depends on reliability. A technique that produces effective cutting edges does not need to change merely because change is possible. Long technological continuity may therefore reflect success rather than cognitive limitation. At the same time, inventions can disappear. A method may be known for several generations and then vanish if population numbers decline or contact networks collapse. This is one of the most important insights from later archaeological patterns. Cultural complexity is not a staircase that only rises, it can contract. Skills can be forgotten. A small population may lose specialized knowledge simply because too few experienced practitioners remain. That possibility helps explain why archaeologists do not find a single technological revolution accompanying the emergence of anatomically modern humans. If cognition, population structure, and cultural transmission all matter, innovations may appear in pulses. During periods when groups are well connected, ideas spread and accumulate. During isolation or demographic decline, traditions fragment. Climate can therefore influence technology indirectly by changing the social network through which knowledge travels. What survives in the record suggests that early Homo sapiens is already capable of technical behavior requiring foresight, precision, and teaching. But so are some other human populations. There is no magic artifact that can be placed on a table and declared the first product of a modern mind. The distinction is more subtle. The real transformation may lie in accumulation. A stone point leads to hafting. Hafting requires binding. Binding encourages knowledge of fibers, resins, and wood. Movement between raw material sources expands geographical awareness. Contact between groups allows techniques to spread. Each skill becomes part of a larger web, and the web can preserve more knowledge than any one individual possesses. Then, among the practical tools, other materials begin appearing whose purpose is harder to explain through cutting, scraping, or hunting alone. Pieces of red ochre are collected and sometimes deliberately ground. Shells travel away from coastlines. Surfaces receive marks that appear intentional. These traces are fragile compared with stone technology and easy to overinterpret, yet they raise a possibility more profound than any new tool shape. Early humans may increasingly be modifying objects not only because of what those objects can do, but because of what they can mean. Meaning is far more difficult to excavate than stone. A sharpened point can often be understood through its shape, fractures, wear, and position beside animal remains. A piece of pigment, a perforated shell, or a deliberately marked surface is different. Its practical function may be obvious in some cases and completely uncertain in others. Yet as Homo sapiens moves deeper into the Middle Stone Age, archaeologists begin finding traces that suggest people are doing more than producing tools for immediate survival. They are selecting colors, transporting unusual materials, modifying objects in repeated ways, and leaving patterns that appear to belong to a social world extending beyond food, shelter, and defense. None of this proves that a fully modern symbolic culture suddenly appears. The evidence remains incomplete, but the scattered clues imply that minds increasingly capable of sharing abstract meanings are becoming archaeologically visible. Red ochre is one of the most persistent of those clues. Ochre is an iron-rich mineral pigment that can produce colors ranging from yellow and brown to deep red. Pieces occur at numerous African archaeological sites, and some show grinding or scraping that indicates deliberate processing. Ochre can have practical uses. It can contribute to adhesives, help treat hides, protect materials, or perhaps serve other technical purposes. Its presence, therefore, cannot automatically be interpreted as body paint or ritual pigment. Yet at some sites, the quantity, selection, or modification of ochre becomes difficult to explain through function alone. One of the most famous later examples comes from Blombos Cave on the southern coast of Africa, where pieces of ochre bear deliberately engraved cross-hatched designs dating to tens of thousands of years before the great painted caves of Ice Age Europe. Other finds from the site include perforated shell beads and evidence that pigments were mixed and processed in containers fashioned from abalone shells. These discoveries are younger than the earliest Homo sapiens fossils, but they matter because they reveal how deep behavioral complexity extends within Africa. This supposed explosion of symbolic behavior, once associated primarily with much later European archaeology, begins to look more like one surviving chapter of a much older story. Even earlier evidence may exist, although interpretation becomes more difficult as the record grows older. Pigments occur at African sites well before the Blombos engravings, sometimes transported and processed repeatedly. What exactly they mean remains uncertain. A lump of red mineral does not preserve the intention of the person holding it. It might colour a body-hide wooden object adhesive or surface. It might distinguish one group from another. It might be valued simply because its appearance is unusual. Scholars still debate the significance of many early pigment finds, and responsible interpretation has to preserve that uncertainty. Shell beads offer somewhat firmer evidence when they appear. A shell deliberately perforated and worn on cord has limited practical value compared with a cutting tool. Its importance likely lies in display. Display immediately introduces another person into the equation. An ornament is meaningful because someone sees it, recognizes it, or responds to it. A bead can communicate affiliation, age, achievement, relationship, identity, or something entirely inaccessible to modern observers. It need not mean the same thing everywhere. The important point is that an object can become part of a shared social code. Once that happens, human appearance becomes a surface for information. Bodies can carry meaning through pigment ornaments, hairstyles, scars, clothing, or other features that rarely survive archaeologically. The familiar face evolving in fossil anatomy may have been far less visually important to ancient people than the social signals placed upon it. Two groups whose skeletons look almost identical could recognize one another instantly through decoration, styles of dress, tool-making, traditions, or gestures that leave no trace in bone. This possibility transforms the significance of long-distance material movement. A shell found far inland may have traveled because its owner personally visited the coast, because groups exchanged objects across neighboring territories, or because an item passed repeatedly through a chain of relationships. If shells or distinctive pigments carry social value, exchange becomes more than the movement of raw material. It can create obligations, alliances, memories, and connections between people separated by geography. Such networks may be crucial during periods of environmental stress. If a local water source fails, knowing people beyond one's usual territory can mean access to another landscape. Social relationships therefore become a form of ecological insurance. An ornament that marks membership or maintains alliance could have consequences far beyond decoration. Archaeology cannot reconstruct the precise institutions involved, but the connection between social networking and survival is plausible in a continent repeatedly divided and reconnected by climate. The development of shared symbols also depends on memory. A mark has no symbolic power if every individual interprets it differently. Meaning must be learned, repeated, and recognized. That creates continuity across generations. A child growing up within such a community does not simply learn how to strike stone. The child learns what certain colors, objects, places, and behaviors signify to other people. This does not require writing. Indeed, writing will not appear for hundreds of thousands of years. Human societies can preserve enormous bodies of knowledge without it. Oral traditions, gesture, ritual repetition, and material symbols can organize memory across generations. The archaeological challenge is that most of those systems vanish completely unless they accidentally involve durable objects. Even the engraved lines sometimes preserved on stone or ochre must be treated carefully. Humans can make marks for many reasons. A repeated geometric pattern may represent deliberate decoration without encoding a specific symbolic message. Calling it art can imply categories that may not have existed for its maker. Calling it notation can be even more speculative. What survives in the record suggests intentional pattern making, but the meaning behind such patterns is rarely recoverable. The same caution applies to claims about language. Complex technology and social symbolism strongly suggest sophisticated communication, and anatomical evidence indicates that early Homo sapiens possesses much of the biological equipment associated with speech. Yet language does not fossilize. Researchers cannot identify the exact moment when syntax, vocabulary, or fully modern speech appears. It may be substantially older than the symbolic artifacts that happen to survive. It may also develop incrementally rather than through one revolutionary leap. What becomes increasingly clear is that anatomy and behavior do not follow identical clocks. People with relatively modern skulls do not instantly produce a uniform symbolic culture, nor do sophisticated behaviors appear only after every anatomical feature reaches the modern condition. Technologies and symbolic practices emerge unevenly, disappear locally and return elsewhere. Population density, social contact environment and preservation all affect what archaeologists see. This makes the idea of a sudden behavioral revolution increasingly difficult to sustain as a universal model. The deeper African record looks patchier but also more interesting. Human capacities may be present long before circumstances allow them to become archaeologically abundant. A small isolated population can possess complex knowledge while leaving only a handful of durable traces. A larger connected population can preserve and accumulate innovations far more effectively. The first mines that seem familiar then may not announce themselves with paintings covering cave walls or monuments visible across landscapes. They appear quietly a mineral carried farther than necessary, a shell pierced carefully enough to hang a repeated mark cut into a surface, a recipe involving several materials, a tool whose construction demands planning across multiple steps. Each clue is modest. Together they suggest that the human world is acquiring a second landscape layered over the physical one, a landscape of meanings. And while this invisible world is growing inside Homo sapiens communities, they are not the only humans capable of complexity. Beyond Africa, other lineages are making sophisticated tools controlling fire hunting cooperatively, caring for injured individuals and possibly using pigments and ornaments of their own. The familiar mind, like the familiar face, is not emerging in complete isolation. Humanity remains plural, and soon the descendants of these different populations will meet in ways that leave traces not merely in stone but inside the genomes of people alive today. Beyond Africa, the human world is already crowded. While Homo sapiens is acquiring increasingly familiar faces, rounded skulls, elaborate technologies, and perhaps richer systems of shared meaning. Other human lineages are following their own paths through Eurasia. Europe and Western Asia are inhabited by populations that will become recognizably Neanderthal. Farther east groups related to the mysterious Denisovans occupy parts of Asia, although their geographical range remains frustratingly difficult to reconstruct. Other populations survive whose identities are known from only a few fossils, archaeological traces, or faint genetic signals. The ancient world is not divided between humans and everything else. It contains several kinds of human beings separated by geography and ancestry, but still close enough that some can recognize one another as potential mates. Neanderthals are the most visible of these lost relatives because their fossil record is unusually rich. They possess long, low skulls, powerful brow ridges projecting midfaces, large noses, strong bodies, and limb proportions suited to conserving heat in colder climates. Their skeletons often preserve evidence of strenuous lives. Broken bones, degenerative joint disease, and healed injuries appear frequently. Yet the old image of Neanderthals as clumsy evolutionary failures has collapsed under decades of research. They manufacture sophisticated stone tools, control, fire hunt large animals, use landscapes strategically, and survive repeated climatic fluctuations across Western Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Some Neanderthals also care for individuals who survive serious injuries or physical limitations. Exactly how much assistance particular fossils required remains debated, but long-term survival in several cases is difficult to reconcile with the caricature of brutally individualistic creatures. They are social humans living in small communities under demanding conditions. Their brains are large, often matching or exceeding Homo sapiens in volume, although their brain shape and developmental patterns differ from ours. The archaeological evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior is more controversial but increasingly difficult to dismiss entirely. Pigments occur at some sites. Eagle talons and other unusual objects appear to have been modified or collected. There are claims for ornaments, deliberate engravings, and possibly cave markings associated with Neanderthal occupation. Individual cases remain disputed, especially when dating or archaeological context is uncertain. No single artifact proves that Neanderthal symbolic life was identical to that of later Homo sapiens, but the broader picture leaves little room for describing them as mentally primitive animals, awaiting replacement by a uniquely intelligent newcomer. Farther east, another lineage remains almost invisible. Denisovans are first recognized not through a complete skull or dramatic skeleton, but through genetic material recovered from fragmentary remains in Denisova Cave in Siberia. A fingerbone teeth and additional fragments reveal a population genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Later discoveries and genetic evidence suggest Denisovan-related populations were spread across a much wider portion of Asia than that Siberian cave alone implies. Their physical appearance remains largely mysterious. A jaw from the Tibetan plateau has been linked to Denisovan-related ancestry through protein evidence, helping show that populations related to them lived at high altitude long before recent humans became established there. This is a remarkable detail. A lineage once known from a tiny Siberian bone turns out to have relatives capable of surviving in the thin air of the Tibetan plateau. Their genetic legacy will later help some modern populations adapt to high-altitude environments. But Neanderthals and Denisovans are only the relatives for whom evidence happens to be comparatively strong. Southeast Asia produces even stranger branches. Homo floresiensis survives on the Indonesian island of Flores until relatively late in prehistory. Small-bodied and small-brained, it nevertheless manufactures stone tools and descends from a much older dispersal of humans into the region. In the Philippines, Homo luzonensis adds another unexpected form to the late Pleistocene human landscape. The precise evolutionary relationships of these island populations remain debated, but their existence shows how diverse the genus Homo has become. Africa itself may contain lineages that do not fit neatly into the emerging Homo sapiens pattern. Fossils such as those from Iwo Eleru in Nigeria preserve combinations of features that have fueled debate about long-lasting population structure within the continent. Southern Africa yields Homo naledi, an extraordinary small-brained human relative whose precise place in the family tree remains uncertain. Some dates associated with Homo naledi are surprisingly recent, demonstrating that anatomical forms with deep roots can persist alongside more modern-looking humans. Claims about deliberate burial or symbolic behavior associated with Homo naledi have generated substantial debate and are not accepted uniformly. This is precisely the kind of evidence that requires restraint. The possibility is scientifically interesting, but extraordinary behavioral interpretations need strong archaeological support. What is secure is already remarkable enough. Human evolution does not operate as a tidy sequence in which one form disappears before another arrives. Imagine the planet during this period without modern species labels. A group crossing a valley in Africa encounters people who look somewhat different, but may belong to a connected population network. Thousands of kilometers north, Neanderthals move between caves, river valleys, and hunting grounds. Across Asia, Denisovan-related groups occupy environments ranging from Siberian mountains to high plateaus and perhaps far beyond. On islands isolated, humans follow evolutionary trajectories unlike anything on the mainland. These populations do not know that future scientists will classify them separately. They simply inhabit territories, raise children, make tools, find food, avoid predators, and respond to neighboring groups. Boundaries between them may sometimes be maintained by geography or social difference. At other times, those boundaries break down. This matters because evolution once was commonly represented as a branching tree whose limbs separated cleanly and never touched again. Genetic evidence has transformed that image. Human lineages can diverge for hundreds of thousands of years and later interbreed. A population can disappear as a distinct group, while portions of its ancestry survive inside another. Extinction in such cases is not complete erasure. The possibility of contact also changes how Homo sapiens expansion should be understood. When members of our lineage eventually move farther into Eurasia, they do not enter an empty continent. They enter inhabited landscapes already known intimately by other humans. Rivers have names in languages that will never be recorded. Hunting routes have been followed for generations. Caves have been occupied repeatedly. Sources of flint are known. Fire has burned in shelters long before newcomers arrive. Homo sapiens may possess advantages in some contexts, perhaps larger social networks, different technologies, demographic resilience, or forms of communication that allow information to spread efficiently. But no single explanation fully accounts for why our lineage eventually becomes the only surviving human species. Climate, population size, competition, disease chance, and interbreeding may all contribute. The most important point at this stage is that there is still no solitary humanity. The familiar face has emerged into a world of unfamiliar cousins, but those cousins are neither irrelevant side branches nor crude failures. They represent successful experiments in being human, some lasting hundreds of thousands of years, and their disappearance will not remove them entirely. Long after Neanderthal camps fall silent and Denisovan populations lose their separate identities, fragments of those ancient people will continue traveling through time inside Homo sapiens. To understand how that becomes possible, the story must move from fossils and stone into a record far smaller than any archaeological artifact, the inherited molecules hidden within living cells. The oldest chapters of human evolution were once reconstructed almost entirely from things that could be held in the hand: skulls, teeth, stone tools, animal bones, ash and sediment. Then genetics opened another archive, one carried inside living people and under exceptional conditions preserved within ancient remains. That archive has made the origin of Homo sapiens both clearer and more complicated. It confirms that living humans share a relatively recent African ancestry, but it also reveals that the populations contributing to our species were not necessarily gathered in one small place. Instead, genetic patterns are increasingly consistent with long periods of population structure separation, reconnection, and mixture. The braided streams suggested by fossils and geography begin to appear at the molecular level as well. Every living human carries a genome assembled from an enormous chain of ancestors. Most sections of DNA have been reshuffled repeatedly through reproduction, making individual genealogical lines difficult to follow far into the past. Yet patterns of variation can still reveal ancient population history. When researchers compared genomes from people living in different regions, African populations contain the greatest overall human genetic diversity. This fits the deep African history of Homo sapiens and the fact that only subsets of that diversity accompanied later migrations into other parts of the world. This does not mean one living African population is unchanged from the beginning of our species. Every population alive today has its own long history of movement, mixture, expansion, contraction, and adaptation. Modern ethnic or linguistic groups cannot simply be projected hundreds of thousands of years backward. The African populations that existed when Homo sapiens was emerging have changed, merged, divided, or disappeared like populations elsewhere. Genetics therefore reconstructs relationships and demographic patterns not preserved prehistoric tribes. For many years, models of modern human origins often emphasized a relatively compact ancestral population somewhere in Africa that later expanded. Increasingly, researchers explore more structured alternatives. In these models, Homo sapiens develops among several populations distributed across different African regions. They are separated enough for genetic and anatomical differences to accumulate, but remain connected enough that those differences can eventually spread through migration and interbreeding. The result is sometimes described as a weakly structured stem or forms of Pan-African origin, though researchers do not all use the same model or terminology. Details remain actively debated. How many populations contributed where they lived? How long they remained separated and how frequently they exchanged genes are all uncertain. Ancient DNA from the crucial periods would help enormously, but Africa's warm climates are generally hostile to DNA preservation. Heat and moisture accelerate molecular decay, leaving scientists with far less ancient genetic material from early African Homo sapiens than they would like. That absence creates a frustrating imbalance. Some of the deepest stages of our species' history occur in regions where genetic evidence is hardest to recover. Researchers must therefore combine younger ancient genomes DNA from living populations, fossil anatomy, archaeology, and statistical models. Each source captures a different part of the story and none is complete. Even so, one conclusion has become increasingly difficult to avoid ancient human populations mix repeatedly. Gene flow is not an unusual accident at the edges of the human story. It is one of its recurring processes. Within Africa, researchers have detected genetic patterns that some models interpret as possible contributions from deeply diverged populations. These signals are sometimes described as evidence of archaic admixture from unknown African lineages, but such conclusions require caution. Similar patterns can sometimes be produced by long-standing population structure without interbreeding with a completely separate archaic species. Scholars still debate how best to interpret these signals, and there is currently no African equivalent of a well-characterized Neanderthal genome from the relevant deep period that could settle the matter cleanly. The uncertainty itself is revealing. It means the ancestors of living humans may have interacted with populations whose fossils have either not been found or cannot yet be confidently identified. A genetic signature can hint at a vanished population without telling us what its face looked like, which tools it made, or what name paleontologists would give it. This is where the traditional family tree begins to fail. A tree is useful when lineages split and remain separated. Human evolution behaves more like a network. Branches divide, but some reconnect. Genes cross boundaries. Populations can remain partially distinct for long periods and then merge. One lineage can contribute ancestry to another without surviving as an independent population. Such mixing does not erase differences immediately. If two populations have been separated for tens of thousands of years, their descendants may carry distinctive genetic variants. After contact, some variants disappear through chance, others persist neutrally, and a few may spread because they provide an advantage. Natural selection can therefore preserve useful genetic material inherited from populations that later vanish. Population size also leaves powerful signatures. When a population becomes small, genetic diversity can be lost through drift. When it expands rapidly, descendants carry only part of the variation present in older populations. These demographic bottlenecks and expansions complicate attempts to locate a single point of origin, because present-day genetic patterns are the result of repeated later events layered over earlier ones. Africa's changing climate provides a mechanism for many of these demographic shifts. During wetter periods, corridors across the Sahara and other regions expand, potentially connecting populations over large distances. During dry phases, habitable zones contract around coasts, highlands, lakes, and river systems. Groups that once exchanged genes can become separated. Later, environmental improvement reconnects some of their descendants. The genetic network breathes with the landscape. There is human scale hidden beneath these models. Gene flow sounds abstract, but every successful transfer of ancestry occurs through people. Someone leaves one community and has children in another. Two groups meet after generations of separation. A partnership crosses a social boundary. A small migrating population is absorbed into a larger one. Over thousands of years, events that may have seemed personal and local reshape the ancestry of entire continents. This perspective also changes what it means to ask where Homo sapiens begins. If several interconnected populations contribute different genetic and anatomical components, then the species may not possess a single geographical point that can honestly be called its birthplace. There can still be important centers, refuges, corridors, and populations, but the deeper origin belongs to a network. The fossil record has already hinted at this. Jebel Irhoud provides an early modern-looking face in northern Africa. Homo preserves a more modern cranial pattern in eastern Africa. Herto reveals another robust variation. Other African fossils add combinations that resist a simple linear sequence. Genetics does not dissolve that complexity. It makes it biologically plausible. By the later Middle Pleistocene, the pieces of Homo sapiens are circulating through a vast and changing population system. Anatomy, technology, genes, and perhaps symbolic traditions move at different speeds. Some populations disappear without descendants. Others contribute disproportionately to later humanity. Many are absorbed into neighboring groups so completely that their independent existence becomes invisible except through subtle traces. Eventually, part of this African network begins extending farther beyond the continent. But even that movement will refuse to behave like a single triumphant migration. Humans will cross into Eurasia more than once. Some expansions will reach distant landscapes and then disappear almost entirely from later ancestry. Others will leave descendants whose genes eventually spread around the planet. The road out of Africa is not one road, and the people walking it are not entering an empty world. The boundary between Africa and Eurasia has never been an absolute wall. At favourable moments, northeastern Africa connects naturally with the Levant through landscapes that can support animals and people, while coastal routes around the Red Sea and Arabian Peninsula offer other possibilities whose exact importance remains debated. The Sahara itself periodically changes from barrier to corridor. Long before the migration that supplies most of the ancestry of living non-African populations, Homo sapiens is already moving beyond Africa. Some of those early journeys succeed for thousands of years. Some may reach surprisingly distant regions, yet many leave little or no detectable ancestry in people alive today. Expansion, in other words, does not guarantee permanence. The Levant preserves some of the clearest evidence. At sites such as School and Kafse, human remains show that early Homo sapiens are present in the eastern Mediterranean, roughly around 100,000 years ago, with dating varying between sites and deposits. These people possess many modern anatomical features, although some individuals remain robust. They occupy a region that repeatedly functions as a biological crossroads between Africa and Eurasia. Climate determines how welcoming that crossroads becomes. During favourable intervals, rainfall increases and vegetation spreads through areas that are otherwise dry, creating routes followed by gazelles, cattle-like animals, predators and humans. Yet these early Homo sapiens populations do not simply expand from the Levant across the world, and become the direct ancestors of everyone outside Africa. Later archaeological layers in the region again contain Neanderthals. The pattern suggests alternating occupation, local replacement population movement, or some combination of these processes. The boundary between the two human groups shifts as climate changes. There is no permanent frontier marked on the landscape. Even older evidence may place Homo sapiens beyond Africa earlier still. A partial upper jaw from Mislia Cave in Israel has been dated to somewhere around 177,000 to 194,000 years ago and attributed to Homo sapiens. If that identification and chronology are correct, people from our lineage reached the Levant remarkably early. Finds elsewhere have pushed the discussion farther east. Fossils and artifacts in Arabia and Asia have been proposed as evidence of early Homo sapiens dispersals, though not every claim carries the same level of certainty. One particularly important fossil comes from Apodyma Cave in Greece. A partial cranium has been interpreted by some researchers as Homo sapiens and dated to more than 200,000 years ago. If correct, it would represent an extraordinarily early presence of our species in Europe. But the specimen is incomplete, and its interpretation has been debated. This is precisely where the fragmentary nature of the record demands caution. A dramatic conclusion resting on a partial skull must remain open to revision. Arabia provides a different kind of evidence. Today, much of the peninsula is extremely arid, encouraging the assumption that it was always a formidable obstacle. Paleoclimate records show otherwise. During wetter intervals, lakes and grasslands spread across interior Arabia. Stone tools and fossils document repeated human occupations of these landscapes. Groups can move through what later becomes desert, following water and animal populations across green corridors. Then the rains fail, lakes shrink into saline depressions, grasslands retreat, populations either contract into refuges or disappear. A route that supports migration for thousands of years can close on geological timescales almost overnight. This rhythm may explain why early expansions beyond Africa fail to produce continuous occupation across every region. Coastlines complicate the picture further. During glacial periods, global sea levels fall substantially as water becomes trapped in continental ice sheets. Large coastal plains are exposed around Africa, Arabia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Those plains may contain freshwater sources, shellfish beds, estuaries, and travel routes attractive to human groups. When sea levels later rise, much of that landscape disappears beneath the ocean. Archaeologists searching modern shorelines may therefore be looking kilometers away from the places ancient people actually used. The popular idea of one rapid coastal migration carrying modern humans neatly around the Indian Ocean is probably too simple. Coastal resources may have been important, but humans also use inland rivers, lakes, grasslands, and mountain corridors. Different populations likely follow different routes at different times. Scholars still debate the relative importance of these pathways because the evidence is uneven, and many potential sites are submerged or poorly explored. Eventually, however, a major expansion occurs that leaves a profound genetic legacy. Most ancestry in living populations outside Africa derives largely from groups that expanded out of Africa roughly between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, though the demographic history is more complicated than a single departure date. These people are descendants of a species already ancient. Homo sapiens has existed in Africa for well over 100,000 years before this expansion begins. The people leaving are not the first modern humans. They are one subset of a much older African population network. This distinction matters. The story is sometimes compressed into an image of Homo sapiens appearing and immediately conquering the world. In reality, our species spends most of its early history within Africa. It experiments with movement beyond the continent repeatedly. Some early migrants establish communities that endure for considerable periods, only to disappear genetically or be absorbed by later populations. Small population size may make these pioneer groups vulnerable. A few thousand people scattered across unfamiliar territory can be devastated by climatic deterioration, disease competition, or simple demographic bad luck. If too few children survive for several generations, an entire regional population can vanish without any dramatic catastrophe. Archaeology may preserve its tools for hundreds of thousands of years while its genes disappear. Other populations may not disappear completely but become absorbed. If a small Homo sapiens group meets a larger neighboring population and interbreeds, its descendants can persist, while its distinct anatomical or cultural identity fades. Conversely, expanding Homo sapiens populations can absorb members of older Eurasian lineages. This process soon becomes visible in extraordinary genetic detail. The people moving outward carry technologies, social relationships, and ecological knowledge developed within Africa, but they must adapt them to unfamiliar worlds. Mediterranean woodland is not tropical grassland. Central Asian winters impose different demands. Northern latitudes bring extreme seasonal changes in daylight. New plants must be learned, new prey tracked, and new sources of stone discovered. Cultural flexibility becomes essential. They also encounter landscapes that are already human landscapes. Neanderthals have lived across parts of Western Eurasia for generations beyond counting. Denisovan-related populations occupy portions of Asia. Other groups may exist without leaving recognizable fossils. The newcomers are not stepping onto an untouched continent. They are entering territories shaped by other human memories. For some early dispersals, the trail simply fades. A jaw, a skull fragment, a cluster of tools, or a brief occupation layer marks a human presence, and then silence returns. The evidence does not always reveal whether the population died, moved away, or merged with others. No single explanation fully accounts for every disappearance, but one later wave does not fade. Its descendants spread farther and farther, eventually reaching lands no previous human population is known to have occupied. Along the way, they repeatedly meet relatives whose lineages separated from theirs hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Those meetings will not end only in competition. Some will end with children ensuring that the supposedly vanished humans of Eurasia become permanent participants in the ancestry of the modern world. When expanding Homo sapiens populations finally meet the other humans of Eurasia in large numbers, the encounters do not produce a clean replacement. For much of the 20th century, one influential version of the story imagined modern humans spreading outward and gradually displacing archaic populations such as Neanderthals, leaving little biological connection between the vanished groups and people alive today. Genetics has overturned that simplicity. The people who disappeared as distinct populations were not always erased. Some became ancestors. Their DNA crossed population boundaries through interbreeding, survived the extinction of the groups that carried it, and remains embedded in millions of human genomes today. The clearest example comes from Neanderthals. When scientists first recovered enough ancient Neanderthal DNA to compare with living humans, they found that most present-day people whose ancestry lies largely outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small but measurable proportion of Neanderthal-derived DNA. The percentage in any one individual is usually only a few percent or less, but different people retain different fragments. Taken together across modern populations, those fragments preserve a much larger portion of the Neanderthal genome than any single person carries. This discovery changes the emotional shape of extinction. Neanderthals disappear from the archaeological record as a recognizable population roughly 40,000 years ago. though exact timing varies between regions. Their camps fall silent, their characteristic skeletal form vanishes and their distinct communities no longer survive. Yet disappearance at the population level does not mean every lineage ended. At least some Neanderthals had children with Homo sapiens, and those children had descendants of their own. The encounters probably happen more than once. Genetic patterns suggest several episodes of admixture rather than one isolated meeting between two populations. Some early Homo sapiens individuals preserve this history with remarkable immediacy. A modern human from Peștera cu Oaii in Romania, dating to around 40,000 years ago, carried unusually large stretches of Neanderthal ancestry, indicating that a Neanderthal ancestor may have lived only a few generations earlier. This person does not appear to have contributed substantial ancestry to later Europeans, but the genome captures a moment when the boundary between the populations was still being crossed directly. Even earlier, a girl from Denisova Cave reveals how tangled these relationships can become. Genetic analysis shows that she had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. Her existence is direct evidence that two highly diverged human populations met and reproduced. Her father himself carried traces of Neanderthal ancestry from an older mixing event. The cave therefore preserves not a simple sequence of separate species, but an interwoven population history unfolding over generations. Denisovan ancestry survives even more strongly in some living populations. People in parts of Oceania and an island Southeast Asia carry significant Denisovan-related genetic ancestry, while smaller Denisovan-derived contributions occur in some Asian populations. The distribution suggests that Homo sapiens encountered Denisovan-related groups somewhere in Asia, perhaps more than once, and possibly in different regions. The precise locations remain uncertain because the Denisovan fossil record is extremely sparse compared with the genetic evidence. That imbalance creates one of prehistory's strangest mysteries. Modern genomes reveal that people once interacted with populations whose physical appearance is barely known. A handful of bones and teeth together with molecular traces represent lineages that must once have numbered many thousands of individuals distributed across enormous landscapes. Their villages or camps, voices, kinship systems, and traditions are almost completely lost. Some inherited archaic DNA appears to have been useful. One of the most famous examples involves genetic variation associated with adaptation to high altitude among Tibetan populations. A version of the EPAS-1 region, which contributes to physiological responses to low oxygen, appears to have entered the ancestors of modern Tibetans through admixture with the Denisovan-related population. This is a striking case in which contact with an extinct human lineage may eventually help later populations survive in one of Earth's most demanding environments. Other inherited variants influence aspects of immune function, skin biology, metabolism, and additional traits, although the effects are often complex. Not every archaic variant is beneficial. Many appear to have been removed gradually by natural selection, suggesting that some combinations were disadvantageous in Homo sapiens' genetic backgrounds. The genomes of living people therefore preserve only a filtered sample of ancient interbreeding. This filtering tells researchers something about the populations themselves. Neanderthals often lived in relatively small fragmented groups, making genetic drift, and the accumulation of mildly harmful mutations more significant. When their DNA entered larger Homo sapiens populations, selection could remove some of those variants over generations. Other segments disappeared simply by chance. A few survived because they were neutral or useful. The pattern also complicates any attempt to define ancient humans as biologically sealed species. Neanderthals, Denisovans and Homo sapiens had been separated long enough to develop substantial anatomical and genetic differences, yet they remained capable of producing fertile descendants, at least in some circumstances. Species boundaries in human evolution are therefore less tidy than textbook diagrams imply. The labels remain valuable, but biology does not always respect the sharp borders those labels suggest. Within Africa, the possibility of mixture with deeply diverged populations is harder to resolve. Some genetic models propose contributions from archaic African lineages that have not yet been identified through ancient DNA. Others explain similar genetic patterns through long-term population structure among ancestral Homo sapiens groups. Scholars still debate the issue, and the absence of very ancient African genomes prevents a simple answer. What can be said with confidence is that human ancestry repeatedly involves separation followed by reconnection. The consequences extend beyond genetics. Whenever populations meet, technologies and behaviors may also cross boundaries. A stoneworking method found in association with one group need not have been invented independently by that group. People can observe, imitate exchange, and adapt techniques. Archaeologists therefore have to be cautious when treating a particular artifact tradition as a perfect marker of biological identity. Competition certainly occurs as well. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals sometimes rely on overlapping prey shelters and landscapes. Climate instability repeatedly changes the availability of those resources. Growing Homo sapiens populations may have placed demographic pressure on smaller Neanderthal communities. Disease transmission between previously separated populations is another possibility, although direct evidence is difficult to recover. No single explanation fully accounts for Neanderthal disappearance. Their extinction may instead result from several pressures working together: small population-size fragmented social networks, environmental instability, competition, demographic absorption, and interbreeding. If even a small number of Neanderthals repeatedly join expanding Homo sapiens populations, the Neanderthal population can decline while some of its ancestry survives. Replacement and mixture are not mutually exclusive. This makes the final emergence of one surviving humanity far stranger than a simple victory. Homo sapiens does eventually become the only remaining human species, but the survivors carry pieces of the people they encountered. The family tree has folded back into itself. Some of the lost cousins are no longer standing beside us because parts of them are standing within us. By the time Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other ancient populations disappear as distinct communities, the familiar human face has spread across an expanding world. Yet that face belongs to a species assembled from deep African population networks and altered again through encounters beyond Africa. Modern humanity is not the untouched endpoint of one pure lineage. It is the surviving product of repeated separation, migration, contact, and reunion. By the end of this long evolutionary passage, the question of when humanity first looked like us no longer has a single satisfying answer. The face arrives before the fully modern brain case. The brain case changes before every region shares the same anatomy. Technologies become more elaborate without producing one universal cultural revolution. Symbols appear in scattered places, disappear and return. Populations divide, reconnect, and exchange genes. Some leave descendants, others vanish. The familiar human form emerges not as a single invention, but as the accumulated result of many populations moving through landscapes that refuse to stay still. This is why the search for a first modern human remains so difficult. A fossil can be old enough to challenge previous models yet still preserve archaic traits. Another can appear strikingly modern while belonging to a population that may not contribute much ancestry to people alive today. A site can contain advanced technology without producing a skull. A skull can survive without preserving any behavior. Each kind of evidence illuminates a different part of the story, and the pieces rarely align perfectly. What survives in the record suggests that Homo sapiens is best understood as a process stretched across deep time. Jebel Ehud reveals that modern-looking facial architecture exists by around 300,000 years ago. Homo shows that more strongly modern cranial anatomy appears deep in the Middle Pleistocene. Hurto preserves a robust population still recognizably within the Homo sapiens range. Later sites add pigments, ornaments, complex tool-making, and long-distance material movement. Ancient DNA then reveals that the story does not end with anatomical modernity. Because our ancestors continue to mix with other human lineages after leaving Africa, this cumulative pattern undermines the older image of evolution as a ladder. There is no sequence of perfectly distinct forms climbing neatly toward the present. Human evolution behaves more like a network of populations changing at different speeds. Some characteristics spread widely, others remain local. Some disappear and reappear through gene flow. Climate repeatedly opens and closes the routes through which those populations meet. Even the concept of modernity becomes unstable when examined closely. Anatomically modern does not necessarily mean behaviorally modern. Behaviorally modern does not mean technologically identical to later hunter-gatherers. A rounded skull does not prove language. A bead does not prove religion. A sophisticated point does not prove one particular social structure. Scholars still debate how these features relate, and the evidence remains incomplete. The strength of the current picture lies precisely in resisting the temptation to force every clue into one dramatic turning point. Instead, humanity becomes recognizable gradually. A child born 250,000 years ago would not know that anything unusual was happening. The parents would not see themselves as transitional. The community would not imagine that future scientists would measure their brow ridges, reconstruct their endocasts, or compare their stone tools with objects made tens of thousands of years later. They would simply live. They wake hungry. They search for water. They remember where animals crossed a valley after the last rains. They repair tools. They carry children. They watch the movements of neighboring groups. They notice changes in wind and cloud. They may grind pigment or wear shells. They may preserve the memory of dead relatives. They may speak languages whose existence can never be demonstrated directly. That ordinary life is where evolution actually happens. Natural selection does not operate on grand historical categories. It works through differences in survival and reproduction repeated across generations. Cultural change works through copying, teaching, forgetting, and invention. Demographic change works through births, deaths, migrations, and marriages. The transformations that eventually produce global Homo sapiens arise from countless small events that would have seemed insignificant to the people experiencing them. This also explains why disappearance can be misleading. A population may vanish genetically while leaving tools behind. Another may vanish archaeologically while its genes survive through mixture. Neanderthals disappear as a distinct people, yet parts of their ancestry continue inside many living humans. Denisovans become almost invisible in the fossil record, yet their genetic legacy survives strongly in some populations. Within Africa, additional ancient lineages may have contributed ancestry that scientists are only beginning to reconstruct. Modern humanity is therefore not a clean replacement of everything older. It is a survivor carrying fragments of several pasts. The final narrowing to one human species happens surprisingly late. For most of the existence of Homo sapiens, other human populations remain somewhere in the world. Neanderthals survive until roughly 40,000 years ago. Denisovan-related groups persist through parts of Asia for uncertain periods. Other lineages may overlap chronologically in regions that remain poorly sampled. Only after these groups disappear does the planet take on the biological condition that feels normal today, one surviving human species. But that condition is unusual when viewed across deep time. For much of prehistory, humanity is plural. The loss of that diversity is difficult to measure because culture does not fossilize like bone. Each vanished population may have possessed its own knowledge of plants, weather animals, geography, kinship, and tool-making. Their languages, stories, gestures, and social rules are gone almost completely. Genetic fragments can reveal ancestry, but they cannot recover a lullaby, a taboo, a joke, a route remembered through generations, or the name given to a mountain. That silence is one of the greatest losses in human history. Yet the silence is not total. Stone preserves gestures. Pigment preserves contact between hand and mineral. Teeth preserve childhood stress and diet. Isotopes preserve movement between landscapes. DNA preserves encounters between populations separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Fossils preserve the gradual reshaping of the face and skull. Each fragment survives because chance allows it to survive. When those fragments are assembled, they do not produce one perfect portrait. They produce something more realistic, a moving crowd. Somewhere in that crowd, faces begin to resemble ours. Later, skulls become rounder. Bodies become somewhat more graceful. Social networks expand. Technologies accumulate. Populations cross continents. Other humans are encountered, sometimes competed with, sometimes absorbed. Eventually, one lineage spreads everywhere. The forgotten dawn was therefore not a morning when humanity suddenly awakened in modern form. It was an age lasting tens of thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands, when the traits associated with living humans slowly converged. There was no witness standing outside the process to announce that the threshold had been crossed. There were only people, and by the time the face looking across the fire had become unmistakably like our own, the deeper transformation had already been unfolding for longer than recorded history has existed. The story ends not with a single skull, a single cave, or a single population, but with a landscape stretching far beyond any one lifetime. Across Africa, rains advance and retreat. Lakes fill and vanish. Grasslands open where desert will later spread. Small communities move between waterstone animals, and memory carrying with them faces that are becoming familiar, and bodies already capable of crossing immense distances. None of them knows that future generations will search their bones for the beginning of humanity. They do not live as beginnings, they live as people. They watch children grow beside fires. They follow paths worn by generations before them. They remember which valley holds water during drought and which distant ridge contains stone that breaks cleanly beneath the hammer. They carry the dead in memory, perhaps in ritual, perhaps only in absence. They meet strangers whose bodies resemble their own, but whose histories have been separated by thousands of years. Sometimes those strangers disappear again. Sometimes their descendants become family. Time erases nearly everything. Voices vanish first, then names. Wood decays, fibers disappear. Footprints are washed away and camps collapse into sediment. Entire populations pass through the world without leaving a fossil that anyone will ever find. What remains is accidental: a tooth beneath volcanic ash, a skull beside an ancient lake, a piece of ochre scratched by a human hand, a shell carried far from the sea, a fragment of inherited DNA surviving inside someone born hundreds of thousands of years later. From those fragments, the forgotten dawn slowly returns. It does not reveal a moment when humanity suddenly becomes modern. Instead, it reveals continuity. Faces change before skulls. Populations separate and reconnect. Knowledge grows, disappears, and is learned again. Human relatives meet, compete, and sometimes become ancestors of one another. The road toward the present is not straight. and it was never leading inevitably toward us. We are simply the branch that remains. And when the modern human face finally becomes common across the world, it carries within it a history far older than civilization, agriculture, or written memory. Behind every familiar feature lies an age of changing climates, vanished cousins, uncertain journeys, and countless people whose individual lives are completely lost. The dawn did not happen once. It unfolded slowly, generation after generation, beneath African skies, beside ancient rivers and forgotten lakes, until one day there was no clear boundary left between those distant people and the humanity that would eventually inherit the earth. Only the face remained, and across 300,000 years of silence it still looks back at us.